All right. We are going to do the second part of the lecture. So if you could pull out your assignment for April 9th, Thursday, April 9th, and we're going to do the same thing we did in the previous assignment where you guys are going to go through anywhere there's yellow, you're going to type in the correct answers as I go through um, the notes with you. Just a general review of the curriculum before we get going any further. So remember, you can pause this video at any time you want in order to type in your answer. So right now, if you need to pause it, that's fine. Pull out your Thursday, April 9th video notes, or not video notes, sorry, worksheet. And we are going to pick up with period 5 in AP US history. Today we're going to do period 5, 6, and 7. So hopefully today's lecture is a little bit shorter than yesterday's. That got long. The formatting's a little bit funky on the worksheet. I'm not sure why. The title is, at least on my screen, the title is different on a separate page from the rest of the notes. So again, period 5 is all about the Civil War, both the causes of the Civil War itself, and the aftermath of the Civil War. And you definitely are going to need to know for the AP exam, what were the causes of the Civil War, and then what were the results of the Civil War? Not just that the Union or the North won, but what was America like as a result of the Civil War? So here we go. So we are going to go to column A, the causes of the Civil War. So if I were to ask you for that first yellow box, this is a very important vocab word that you definitely should know. In the 1840s, what was the idea that America was supposed to take over more land all the way to the Pacific Ocean? And this idea was justification used by the US government and white settlers to take Native American land. What was this idea or belief that God wanted Americans, especially white Americans, to move west and all the way to the Pacific Ocean and take over land? And so what you should type in that first yellow box is manifest destiny. You might ask yourself, well, what does manifest destiny have to do with the Civil War? Well, here's what it has to do with the Civil War. Um, as Americans and white Americans moved west, many slave owners wanted to take their slaves with them and expand slavery. Many people in the North did not want that to happen. And so that's where you have this real debate and tension among the North and the South, pro-slavery, anti-slavery people, because yes, everybody agreed it's great that America, well, except for, of course, Native Americans, all of white America agreed expanding westward is a good thing. But the expansion of slavery led to a lot of debates, which eventually led to the Civil War. So on your next yellow box, if I was to ask you, what war happened between 1846 and 1848 and ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? Basically, it caused Mexico to lose uh, a huge chunk of its country, and America to gain about a fourth of what now is the United States of America. Lands all the way from Texas to California for a very low price of $15 million. Which war am I talking about? I'm talking about the Mexican-American War. And again, the Mexican-American War in some ways is one of the causes to the Civil War, because all this new land, is this new land going to be slave land or is it going to be free land? All right. And we're going to continue moving on down column A, the causes of the Civil War. And that third yellow box moving down, the Homestead Act of 1862, you should definitely know that. That's where the United States government basically said, hey, move west. We're going to sell you really cheap land. Of course, that land really should not have been the United States government's to sell. It was Native American land that was taken from them. It led to the Sand Creek Massacre, Battle of Little Bighorn, and Indian removal. So in that third box, you should be writing just Native American land loss in the West. that's important to know that this is happening all right before the Civil War. And actually, during the Civil War, Native Americans are able to gain a little traction and a little bit of power because the United States was focused on fighting itself. But then after the war, westward expansion and Native American land loss continued. All right. Again, during this time period, um, you have in the 1840s and 50s, Asian Americans coming, German Americans, Irish Americans, Scandinavian ethnic communities all coming. So in that fourth box, I just need you to know that there was, you can type in a pre-Civil War immigration. Immigration uh, was on the rise because there was all this land to the west and opportunities for immigrants to move there as well, not just white Americans who were already living in the United States. And then during the Civil War, this immigration really slowed down because anytime there's a war, immigration slows down. Okay, but of course, you have a movement in America, and I am on that yellow box right above the Know Nothing Party, who was very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, which is causing private Catholic schools to start because Catholics were like, we can't send our kids to public schools in America. It's so anti-Catholic and I guess maybe racist or isn't the right word, but prejudiced. And so you have the nativist movement. So in that yellow box above Know Nothing Party, type in nativist movement. Don't get thrown off because I know today when we hear nativist or native, we think of Native Americans, which makes sense. The nativist movement was a very racist, anti-immigrant movement in the United States, and basically the nativist people in the Know Nothing Party, because whenever they got called racist or anti-immigrant, they said, "We know nothing. We know nothing of what you're talking about." They believed they were native to America, even though they were immigrants or their relatives or ancestors were immigrants, and they wanted to keep out these new immigrants. Funny how we forget our history so quickly. All right, scrolling down, we are going to move to and go on to the next page. I want to stay in column A. Okay. If I were to ask you, what was the Free Soil Party? Okay, and what I'm talking about here, see the yellow box right above um, the Free Soil Party in the North? There was a free soil movement which basically said, hey, slavery is not compatible with free labor and capitalism, although it's very compatible with capitalism, which is the exploitation of workers for the owners of businesses' general gain. If I were to ask you which party in America right before the Civil War was the Free Soil Party, which was the anti-slavery party, what would you say? Hopefully you would say the Republican Party, which I know that seems a little bit backwards to today because the Republican Party today focuses less on civil rights. But the anti-slavery Free Soil Party in the North was the Republican Party. That is why Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Okay, and then going to the next yellow box, who, so you have the Republicans, who was the pro-slavery, anti-free slavery party in the South? The correct answer is the Democrats. So make sure you write the Democrats in for the party in the South. Um, Again, that might seem a little bit backwards to us today, but back then you had Republican was anti-slavery and Democrat was pro-slavery. Okay, so moving down that column, if I was to ask you to say to you, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which remember that was like this great idea where just let the people decide in the territories who should be free and who should be, if that territory or state should be free or slave territory, which led to Bleeding Kansas and the Civil War, um, the Dred Scott decision. All of these were either court cases or federal actions and legislations that really highlight, you can type in the debate over slavery in the territories, which this in a lot of ways is the cause of the Civil War. Okay. But in my argument, the number one thing, the straw that broke the camel's back the number one thing that causes the South to secede, what that means is to leave and try to start their own country. I would say the number one cause of that was happened in 1860. What happened in 1860, which finally pushed the South over the edge, causing them to leave the United States and try to start their own country? That would be the election of President Lincoln in 1860. You should definitely know that date because I would say that is a very key moment in American history. Okay, so make sure you get Lincoln's election right above the 1860 date. Okay, so now we're going to scroll back up and we're going to go to column B, which is about the Civil War. All right. One thing I think that is important to know in this course and even studying for the test, you don't need to know a lot about the wars. This is not a military history course. What it is, though, you need to know the causes of wars and the impact of wars. It's like causes and effects. So here we go. We're on the Civil War. And if I were to ask you, you know, which side, the North or the South? Remember, North is Union, South is Confederate. Which side had a lot of factories, had more men, had better strategy, was led by Ulysses S. Grant? Which side was that? And you should write in the North or the Union advantages in that first yellow box above factories. These are all a list of advantages the North of the Union had. They had emancipated slaves from the South fighting for them, including black soldiers. The 54th of Massachusetts is the most famous all-black regiment. It was the first one to see military battle. And then there was one key event that you should know during the Civil War that could show up on the exam. And this event really kind of changed the entire point of the war. It was an event that made the war not just about trying to keep the country together, but actually about slavery. And it caused Europe to no longer support the South. And it was Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So right above where it says war becomes about slavery, I want you to type in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And this is where he really, kind of redefines the war and says, hey, this war is really about slavery, and the result of this war is going to be the ending of slavery if the North wins. Okay, which it did. Thank God. Okay, here we go. So now, like I said, not a ton of information about the war itself. I don't think will be on the exam. So switch over to the right-hand column. So here are the results of the Civil War. Okay, I told you that there are 3 amendments that you absolutely have to know for the AP US history. Okay, so which amendment ends slavery in the United States of America, or at least formally ends chattel slavery in theory in the United States of America? So right above end slavery in the U.S., you should write down the 13th Amendment. Okay. However, in the next yellow box, we know that former slaves were still forced to work for many times their former masters, and they were paid very little, still in the cotton fields, and increasing more and more debt every year. So what was that system of farming where both poor whites and poor blacks, remember there were actually more poor whites doing this than poor blacks, but they were both stuck farming for landowners. That vocab word is sharecropping. Okay. So there was some hope after the Civil War for African Americans and actually the country as a whole. There were these radical Republicans from the North that went down and wanted to take away land from former slave owners and redistribute it to African Americans. Remember, we have 40 acres and a mule. And so this time period where America was trying to create a country of equality throughout the South, pass legislation and redistribute land and resources was called the period of Reconstruction. So please write down Reconstruction right above Northern Radical versus moderate Republicans. All right, scrolling down, we have people like Hiram Revels, Blanche K. Bruce, and Robert Smalls. Right above them, I want you to write down African Americans in Congress in the South. This just shows you how much progress was made right after the Civil War. These are African American men, some of them former slaves, who are actually representing the South in the United States Congress. Unfortunately, that did not last very long. Okay, scrolling down, we have the South refusing to change state laws. We become black codes, which eventually turn into Jim Crow laws. Um, and this would basically be the failure of Reconstruction. So you can type in that yellow box above. Um, South refuses to change. The failure of Reconstructions. You have the debate of federal versus state laws. So, for instance, United States says, slavery's over, but they create a bunch of black codes that basically just lock up African Americans, and you have convict leasing, where they're turned into slaves, and their only real alternative is sharecropping. Okay, one important piece of legislation that made African Americans full citizens in theory was which amendment? Which amendment made African Americans full citizens? Please type in 14th Amendment right above African Americans full citizens. All right, another important amendment to know. And then another important amendment, scrolling down above, voting rights for black men. However, there were still poll taxes, state laws to keep black men from voting, but the federal law that said black men could vote was which amendment? Yes, the 15th Amendment. Make sure you know the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment for the exam. Those are important. Of course, black women and white women do not get the right to vote. And during this time period after the Civil War, the government invests heavily into railroads and Western expansion, and increases its ties to Asia. We're going to get into those a little bit more in period 6. Okay, that kind of took a long time, but here we go. Period 6. Moving on to period 6. Period 6 is a time period that goes from 1865 to 1898. It is also post-Civil War time period. America becomes a more industrialized nation. Again, period 5, which we just talked about, period 6 and period 7, all about 10 to 17% of the exam will have this curriculum. So let's jump right in. If you need extra help on period 6, you're going to want to look at chapters 16, 17, and 18 in your textbook. Okay, here we go. So period 6, we're going to start in column A, is really all about the growth of big business, the robber barons. I think this time period is very similar to today, where corporations really have complete control of America and the political system. So this is awesome. I'll often referred to as the Gilded Age, and they create monopolies and trusts. So basically, one person or one company gains complete control of an industry. Um, and these big business owners preferred a French word called laissez-faire economics, which basically just means, hey, government, stay out of the economy, let it just play out, which does not work out well for small businesses and the worker. Okay, so here we go. So one of the most important inventions was the assembly line, but we'll get to that more in a second. So which group of Americans defended their actions with social Darwinism? You should definitely know that the rich, so they should type in the very wealthy or the rich, right above defend their actions with social Darwinism. The rich love social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest. We're rich because we're the best. People are poor because they're poor. Very, very dangerous, and I would say argue racist ideology. So, of course, during this time period, you have huge gaps between the rich and the poor. That gap widens again. That's why I think it's so similar to the time period we have today. Now, I think you need to know who some of these robber barons are. So, if I asked you who was the steel robber baron, who had complete control of the steel industry in America, and then eventually sold it for a ton of money. The person you need to write in above steel is Andrew Carnegie. I'm not super worried about spelling. If you are, you can Google it and get the correct spelling. And then who was the robber baron or had complete control of the oil industry? The correct answer to that is John D. Rockefeller. So please type in John D. Rockefeller above oil. Who had control of the majority of railroads in the United States? Please type in Vanderbilt right above railroads. Actually, a college in Tennessee named after him. And then who had control of the car industry and invented the assembly line? You should type in um, Henry Ford. And then the banking industry, the person who had the main control of that, please above banks, type in JP Morgan. All right. So if we continue to scroll down onto the next page, staying in column A, um, the wealthy basically said, hey, we'll take care of the poor. It's our job to take care of the poor. The government doesn't need to have interventions or programs to help with the poor. We'll do it, which did not happen. Okay, here we go. We're going to go to column B now. So column B is about, well, what was going on with the governments and politics during this era of big business growth and industrialization in America. So of course the government is giving out chunks of money to people, and the people they're actually giving these money out to, in the two big companies, so that first yellow box underneath column B, politics, I want you to type in the railroad companies and the telephone companies. So the United States government is giving large chunks of money to the owners of the railroad company and the telephone company to extend communication across the United States and transportation through the railroad and telephone industries. Similar to today, the government gives the majority of its money to large corporations to build things like stadiums. Okay, so moving down, we have the yellow box that goes work with big businesses to gain control of natural resources in Pacific, Asia, and Latin America. Again, the United States is cutting deals with these countries to get access to their resources for big businesses. So in the two yellow boxes above work with big businesses, one should be the railroad industry, the railroad companies, and the second one should be the telephone companies. If you put them in one yellow box, that's fine. Okay. And then the political scene becomes really corrupt. You have political bosses. The most famous one is Boss Tweed. You know, he was famous for, he would go around and tell the immigrants, hey, I'll take care of you. You just need to vote for me. Super corrupt, connected to the corporations. And if you remember that political cartoon, Bosses of the Senate, it was really the corporations who were in control of the politicians, who made all the laws. And I would say that is very, very similar to today. Okay, now there were some people that were attempting to deal with all this corruption in the government, and they tried to pass laws and set aside land. And we're going to skip down to fighting to protect natural resources, land and water from corporations, because corporations were just cutting down forests, building factories next to rivers and dumping pollutants into rivers, and just basically destroying natural resources in America and the environment. And thank goodness natural parks were established. And do you know which president established natural parks? This is going to be that yellow box underneath natural parks established. He was also known as the Trust Buster because he took on the major corporations. His name was Teddy Roosevelt. So I want you to type in Teddy Roosevelt and his buddy John Muir. Again, I'm not worried about spelling, in that yellow box underneath national parks established. He also set up the U.S. Fish Commission, the Sierra Club, and Department of Interior. Scrolling down, there was another political party that was starting to rise during this time period. And it was actually started by farmers who were trying to unite to fight against the railroad industry for charging them ridiculous amounts to ship their crops. They were forming unions. They wanted more political reform, stronger government control of the economy, and they were led for a time by Huey Long. Do you know the name of this political party? The correct answer is the Populist Party. Okay, and we know that anything that's an attack on capitalism doesn't usually go over big in America. And Huey Long was actually assassinated because of his beliefs, similar to today, where Bernie Sanders probably will not get the Democratic nomination because he is not pro capitalism. Here we go. Again, during this time period is um, America's expanding west and exploiting resources and land. Native Americans are continued to get kicked off of their land. The United States government continues to violate treaties. The Morrill Act of 1862 strips land from Native Americans and actually builds colleges on this land. Pretty depressing, huh? Um, the United States government gets very aggressive and even sends the U.S. military, the army, to deal with Native Americans. Chief Joseph in the West is chased all the way almost to Canada, where he is finally stopped. He's from the Nez Perce tribe. You have the ghost dance movement in the Midwest, and then now we're to 1887. Okay, there was a very significant law passed on that really impacted Native Americans in 1887. It was a law that tried to get Native Americans to own land individually and not as a tribe, trying to break up their tribal identity. And it basically was a total hustle that stripped them of their land and their identity as a sovereign nation. And that law was called the Dawes Act of 1887. I think it's important that you know that one. Okay. And obviously during this time period, racist, discriminatory laws are continuing to get passed. You have Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically in 1896, which basically establishes, yeah, it's fine to have completely separate schools, facilities, segregated railroad cars, buses, etc., as long as they're equal. You have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is trying to keep Chinese immigrants from coming to America, yet at the same time they weren't passing immigration acts for European countries. So those are important laws to know as well. Okay, we are on our last column of the period 6 curriculum guide. So we're going to jump to the top. So what's happening culturally or socially? Socially always refers to, you could think of like social justice, social equality, relationships between different groups of Americans. So here we go. During this time period, cities grow. You have poor immigrants that are coming in from especially Europe, and they are moving into cities because that's where the factories are. That's where the jobs are. Of course, they're not paid well and they work ridiculous hours. Their children are even having to work in the factories. But the cities are the best place for them to be. This is where you have like German neighborhoods and Irish neighborhoods, and Polish neighborhoods where they try to live by people who speak their language and share their culture. Even African Americans and women are moving to the city as part of the Great Migration during this time period to get jobs, but of course they're facing huge racial discrimination, and you actually have immigrant groups pitting themselves against African Americans because they're fighting for the same jobs. Of course, the rich, the robber barons, are getting more and more rich because they own these big businesses, and they're not paying their workers very much for their long hours, and they're just collecting more and more profit. But again, some people are beginning to challenge this corporate greed, and you have the utopian societies and the social gospel develop where people are like, wait a second, maybe we should follow again in the line of thinking of the Second Great Awakening. Maybe we should follow what the Bible teaches, and actually we can have an economy and a society and a country where there is more equality and fairness. Women are working hard to improve society. They pushed hard for the temperance movement, which was making alcohol legal. Big mistake, though. Did not work well. We'll get into that in a second. And there is one woman for sure I think you should know, and that's this first yellow box here. And she started settlement houses, and they were basically places for immigrants to go and get resources, get medical care, get education. And the person who I want you to type in above settlement houses is Jane Addams. I probably should have given you more yellow boxes for this column, but it is what it is. Again, the South during this time period is dominated by sharecropping and tenant farmers. The South, with the building of the railroads, is becoming more connected to other parts of the country, which is helping their economy. But really, again, the only people who are benefiting there are the wealthy, large landlords and some of the new industry factory owners that are developing in the South. The South is improving mechanization of farming, and there's increased food production and reduction in crops, prices of crops. The problem with that, though, is it did put a lot of, well, maybe it was a blessing in disguise. It put a lot of sharecroppers out of business because there was less need for manual labor, and some of them began moving to the north. Again, you have farmers organizing through unions, farmers unions like the Grange and the Las Gorras Blancas, the Colored Farmers Alliance. Westward expansion again is happening during this time period. You have the Transcontinental Railroad. You have miners and ranchers and farmers all moving to the west. Of course, this leads to violent competition for land between white settlers and Native Americans and even Mexican Americans living in the southwestern part of the United States. Again, racist groups, you have the nativists who are saying America is for white people, not these new immigrants coming. They were trying to make America great again. Yeah, some things don't die easy. So you have these other people that are coming to the forefront. You have W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. So in that first yellow box above them, these are I want you to type in African American leaders fighting for African American rights. They were the Dr. King and Malcolm X about 60 to 75 years before Dr. King and Malcolm X. And then you also have people like Ida B. Wells, who's fighting both for women's rights and African American rights in her anti-lynching campaign, and people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, that second yellow box above W.E. Du Bois, I want you to fight women's rights leaders. So these movements are still happening, and you have the social gospel that's working towards trying to create a more just society. Okay, here we go. Last one for today. We have period 7. Changes in the United States, how the U.S. relates to the rest of the world, 1890 to 1945. This is the last period of U.S. history you will be responsible for the AP exam, which breaks my heart a little bit because the civil rights, the Cold War, 9/11, all those things I think are so important, but the College Board has made a decision not to have those be part of the test, since some classes around the country that shut schools down before us didn't get to that material. It just is what it is. Okay. So again, now we're moving into the 1900s, the 20th century. And we're going to talk about America at home, and then we're going to talk about America overseas, which will include things like World War I, World War II, and the age of imperialism. So America in the 1920s is shifting from a more rural to urban society. Immigrants coming to America, African Americans and poor whites from the South moving to the North into cities. Again, you have large corporations continuing to dominate America. I made you a list of the robber barons again. But you also have during this time period more reformers, okay? So this is a term we didn't probably talk about enough. So above reformers for the 1890s and 1900s, I want you to write progressives or progressive reformers. These were people that were trying to fight against the major corporations in the unjust America. They did things like create the Antitrust Act. They created the Federal Reserve. Again, Teddy Roosevelt is the trust buster. He's the one American politician who was not entirely bought out by the corporations, and he took them on and fought to break up the trust. Remember, the trusts were just basically these robber barons, these large corporations cutting deals with each other like, hey, how about you, railroad company, only ship my steel and nobody else's steel, or only ship my oil, and then we can put all those other people out of business, and we can totally control the American industry. You have the muckrakers. Remember, the muckrakers were people that were raking up the muck. They were reporters like Ida Turnbull, who were not afraid to write editorials and newspaper articles about people like Rockefeller and their corrupt business practices. You have the women's suffrage movement um, continuing to grow during this time period, which leads to um, the women's right to vote, important amendment, that is the 19th Amendment in 1920. And then you also have prohibition, which made alcohol legal in the 20s, which was not a good law. It was totally backfired. Okay, here we go. We have a yellow box above 1921 and 1924 limited immigration to the United States. You need to type in the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924. This is post World War I. Anytime there's a war or a big conflict, you're going to see a real slowdown in immigration, just like right now we're dealing with the coronavirus. And there's going to be huge restrictions on immigration moving forward. So those are important laws to know that immigration was being slowed down during this time period. The United States government also restricts freedom of speech during World War I. Basically, you weren't supposed to criticize the government. That is totally a violation of the Constitution, but they did it anyways. Okay, so if I were to ask you, and you definitely should know the answer to this, what was the time period in American history from 1929 to 1942 that was caused by the stock market crash that leads to the government having more regulation over the economy, the Dust Bowls happening, and this time period is called the Great Depression. So make sure you write down the Great Depression above 1929 to 1942. Okay, and then we have FDR. Scrolling down to the next page, who becomes the president after Hoover, because Hoover basically was a social Darwinist, like, hey, we don't need to do anything. The economy will fix itself. That didn't go over big with the American people who are struggling. So he loses his reelection bid to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR has this plan. And he has all these programs like the National Recovery Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Writers Project, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, to get America out of the Great Depression. What was his plan? It was called the, please type in New Deal underneath FDR response with. So he comes up with the New Deal to try to get America out of the Great Depression. It doesn't necessarily get America out of the Great Depression, but it gives people hope and optimism and does provide jobs for some Americans. Huey Long thought that FDR should have taken it further. Again, he was from the Populist Party. He thought, there should be more of a redistribution of wealth, and he gets killed for his ideas. Again, conservatives in Congress, they believe that the New Deal is going too far and doing too much. And so this is where there's a shift, where the Democrats become the more socially conscious, bigger government, more regulations during this time period, during the Great Depression. This is where African Americans, for the most part, go from being Republicans to Democrats. And the Republicans and the conservatives are like, whoa, the New Deal is doing way too much. We should not be having so much government intervention. So there is a legacy of the New Deal. We see elements of the New Deal today. The United States becomes a social welfare state. You have programs like Section 8 housing and food stamps and WIC, which also get a boost during the Johnson administration in the 60s with his War on Poverty and Great Society programs, which unfortunately are not going to be on the exam because they're cutting that out of the exam. You have African Americans becoming Democrats for the first time. That is still true today. The majority of African Americans support the Democratic Party over the Republican Party. You have the Social Security Act. We have Social Security today. You have the government assuming the responsibility to help provide for the poor. You also have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which says, hey, if you put money in the banks, it's going to be fully insured by the government. And if something happens, you are not going to lose all that money. Okay, so in the 1920s, you have a ton of cultural debates. Okay, women get the right to vote. So women are like, yes, finally, a little bit of equality. And of course, the young women say that's not enough. We want to do everything that the men do. We want to be able to we want to be able to drink and smoke and work outside the home and go to parties and dance and wear comfortable clothing just like men do. Those women are called the flappers. You have the debates between the traditional versus um, the modern. Sometimes the fundamentalists versus the modern Americans. You have debates of the urban versus rural, different cultures developing. You have, fundamentalist Christians that follow a very conservative version of Christianity versus people who believe science. We should follow science more. And of course, you have the debates between the workers and the owners, the management and the workers, which leads to labor unions. You also have the Red Scare because the Bolsheviks, which we're going to get to in a second, um, the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a bunch of Bolshevik to Americans. The Bolsheviks take over in Russia and they're communists, and there's this big scare that this communism is going to spread to America and people with money are going to lose money. And that's why you have a lot of those immigration laws of the 1820s. You have, here's a yellow thing I need you to type in right above AA, that stands for African Americans moved to the North during World War II for jobs, and that leads to the Harlem Renaissance. So what is that time period or that era in America? What is it called when African Americans are moving from the South to the North and the West for jobs and opportunities? That is called the Great Migration. Make sure you type that in the yellow above African Americans moving to the North. And then World War II breaks out. And I think it's important for you to know that a lot of women are holding it down in the factories, keeping America going during the war. And it also, World War II creates job opportunities for African Americans as well. One of the things that you should definitely know is Japanese Americans are sent to internment camps because there's fear that they're going to help Japan, even though many of them are American citizens. So make sure you write that in the last yellow box of period 7 underneath the first column. Okay, swinging back up. Here's our last column of today's lecture. What is America doing overseas during this time period? You definitely need to know this term for the AP exam. And just in general, you should know this term. So America, if I was to ask you, why does America go to imperialism, which is the term you need to know? Why does America start to expand outside of its borders? Why does it go and buy Alaska and buy Hawaii and enter the Spanish-American War and obtain the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico? The real reason is in the 1890s, in that first yellow box up there, I need you to type in the western frontier is closed. America has decided that, wow, we've pretty much taken over all the land in continental North America that we can. Let's start expanding outward. And this is the age of imperialism. Of course, there's big debates within America over whether or not America should really be doing this. You have the imperialists versus the anti-imperialists. Dollar diplomacy is a word you should probably know. That's basically America going and cutting deals with these Asian countries to get access to the resources for large corporations in America. And America feels it needs to do this because America is rising to be one of the most powerful countries in the world. And they're trying to keep up with Europe, who had been exploiting countries in Africa and Asia for decades. So you have the isolationists versus the expansionists. Some Americans thought we should just stay to ourselves. We should not worry about everybody else. They're the isolationists, while others were expansionists and thought America should be continuing to expand its empire into other places. So if I were to ask you which war had America, most Americans wanted to remain neutral at first. So that's not a big enough hint because that could be multiple wars. But President Wilson convinced America to join the war in defense of democratic and humanitarian principles. What war was President Wilson the president for? You need to type in World War I above at first U.S. remained neutral. The United States Army during this war is referred to as the American Expeditionary Force, and it plays a very limited role in the war. The United States really jumps in World War I at the very end, just as the Russians are pulling out because they have their own issues with the Bolshevik Communist Revolution. You have the first all-black regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, who perform extremely well in World War II or World War I, excuse me, but of course come back and are treated terribly. Eventually, the Treaty of Versailles is signed with the leading of President Wilson. This is the treaty that effectively ends World War I, but it also places all the blame on Germany, which does not go over well because it motivates and puts German people in a desperate situation to follow a desperate leader, uh, Adolf Hitler. So during the 1930s, the United States remains isolated because the United States is in a Great Depression, and really that Great Depression is a worldwide depression. And so all countries are really struggling, especially Germany, because all this debt was placed on them and all this restrictions. You are coming out of the Red Scare in the late 1900s. Um, and so there's this fear in America that communism is going to spread to America. But of course, Mexicans are still allowed to come to America as part of the Bracero program to work on limited visas, just not become U.S. citizens. Eventually, initially America passes all these neutrality acts. We're going to stay neutral. We're going to stay out of World War II because we can't handle getting involved in somebody else's war. World War I was a mess. And the only people who really benefited from World War I in America were the bankers and the defense industry who made guns and weapons. But America is forced into World War II with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and is forced to enter the war. And the United States justifies the entrance into this war because they're fighting against fascism. Fascism is where you have one supreme dictator who completely rules. This was going on in Soviet Union, who actually ended up being an ally of the United States during World War II, but especially in Germany, Spain, Italy. And again, America justifies this. We're fighting for democracy. Again, America knew the Holocaust was happening. That is not why we entered the war. If you remember, there was a whole ship of Jewish refugees that came to America that the United States met with gunboats and said, go back to Europe. Many of them died. One of the biggest contributions that America makes during World War II is we were able to make a lot of stuff and make it really well. Car factories turned into tank and plane factories, and the women were really the backbone of these factories. And the United States was able to make more weapons to support the Allied efforts than any other country. And that was America's greatest contribution to World War II. D-Day, that's a term you should probably know. That's when America finally invaded Europe. Very, very high casualty fatality rates in D-Day. And then America went on to fighting Japan in what was called island hopping, where they're hopping from island to island in the Pacific Ocean, fighting the Japanese. High casualties in these battles. And then it leads to the debate in America, should America drop the atomic bomb? President Truman decides, yes, we're going to drop the atomic bomb, drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan, which forces them to surrender. Most military leaders said it was the wrong decision. It was unnecessary. Huge effects, killed not millions, killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens. And that debate still goes on today. Was that the right thing to do? A lot of people believe that Truman did that to flex on the Soviet Union and show them not to mess with us once World War II was ended. So America emerges from World War II as the top dog in the world, the most powerful country in the world, the best military. World War II had the least impact on the United States of the other world powers because the war wasn't fought here, other than if you count Pearl Harbor. So the United States leaves World War II as the top country in the world. I'm not going to give you any lectures or notes on periods 8 and 9, even though I love period 8, because it's not going to be on the exam, and I don't want to waste your time with that. So I love you guys. I miss you guys. Sorry that went longer than I thought it was going to, but I can't help myself when I start talking history. Hopefully this is helpful, and we're just going to keep plugging away and reviewing for this exam. Love you. Hope you're all doing well. Remember, shoot me a text, send me an email with whatever you need.